Self-raid. Nope, I'm on. I can see you. Of course, the way Twitch has been tonight, it's possible that there's just a massive delay because Laura's stream was very laggy. So, hello. I'm assuming that this video will catch up with whoever is raiding right now, um, pretty soon. And hi, I'm Elena. It is Tuesday night, so this is And Sewing is Half the Battle live. I don't actually have a name for this stream. I should probably come up with one. I will entertain suggestions in the chat if anybody has a clever title for that. Hey, okay, people are finally seeing me. Is everybody hearing me? Is my audio working? Because every time I do this, the audio goes wrong. So I'm assuming that nobody has yelled at me yet about. Okay, good, audio is working. So welcome. Welcome to all of Laura's raiders who have come from her channel. You have no excuse for being late because she was giving a great talk on procrastination and how to fix that. So awesome. Everybody's here on time. So if you came to this stream via any of my social media, you saw that I have a bit of an announcement. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to do some garment alterations and some actual sewing and patterning and stuff. So there will be actual cosplay work done, but first I have some talking to do. And going live is half the battle. Believe me, that pushing that go live button, that is everything Laura was talking about in her stream about the stress of if I put this out there and something goes wrong, that is this stream every single week. First, big announcement. So this is a big announcement to me. It's been in the works for a little while, and I signed the contract today, so yay, I can actually officially talk about it. And I'm very excited about it. But Worbla is a thermoplastic. It is actually a company that makes a lot of thermoplastics. There are many, many different types of them. They have a cosplay sponsorship program where they will do sponsored builds and have cosplayers sign on to make featured costumes out of their products and then do a sponsorship for it. And I just signed the contract to be one of Worbla's builders. Yay! So I have an official Worbla sponsorship for my next build, which will be Flynn Shifo from Tales of Vesperia, which if you've been watching the last few weeks, I have been working on that in bits and pieces. So you may have gotten bits. Flynn's head is behind me. I've got pieces of Flynn all over the place. But I'm going to be doing some live building of some of the armor coming up in the next several weeks, whenever the materials arrive. I don't know how long they take to ship from Canada. So I'll be doing some of that, and then I will be putting out full tutorials with detailed photos and videos showing the step-by-step of how I build everything. So lots of material coming, lots of very cool stuff I should be working on. I'm making like swords and shields and full body armor for this, and like it'll be really awesome. I'm very excited about this costume. So that was the big announcement, is I'm doing Worbla sponsor build, and I will be posting more about that on social media. So if you want to keep up with all of the progress shots, since I'm not doing it just on Tuesday nights, obviously that's a big enough project and I have a deadline for it. So I will be working on that multiple days a week. And feel free to follow me on any of the social media, which are at the bottom of the screen, I think, if I have done this correctly. And I'm on everything as And Sewing's Half the Battle, except for Original Glaze, because they don't allow that many characters in your username. So I am AVA Antares on Original Glaze, which I think is still in alpha or beta, so not many cosplayers are on there, but eventually it'll be open. So, yay! So yeah, that was the fun part, and now I'm going to be working on stuff. So what I'm doing today is altering a found item. Let me drag my body double in here for cosplay. So this is a child's shirt. It's just a short-sleeved Oxford shirt. This is my duct tape dummy it's on, and as you can tell, it's a little bit small for me. I think it's a size 14 child's shirt, which was deliberate because it's supposed to hang open in the front. I'm going to be tailoring it. I'm going to be adding cuffs to the sleeves and changing the collar to be a stand-up collar with a cutout in the front. So just some simple alterations, and technically I should move the pocket from this side to this side, but I don't know if I'm going to bother because I don't know if anybody will notice, and honestly the pocket's pretty well installed and it's got reinforcing stitching, so I might just leave that. But I'm going to do as much of that as fits into an hour, so you can hang out and watch me do things, and I'll be talking through the process. But thanks for stopping by, and without further ado, let's do tailoring. So the main thing that needs to be done is this needs to actually be shaped, because this shirt is a box. It's not very attractive at all. And the duct tape dummy was made with me wearing my binder. So if I turn it sideways, you will see that it is not curvy. It is Hey, look, I have a side by side here. It is not shaped like me as a girl. It is shaped like me when I am actually dressed as a male character, which is the majority of my costumes. So that's why I'm using it for tailoring. Also, it saves me some trouble because I can't really pin things on myself very easily. So if you have never made a duct tape dummy, they're very easy. You just get an old t-shirt you don't mind ruining, go to, thrift store or something, or get a free shirt somewhere, and then you wrap your body in duct tape, or rather have a friend wrap you in duct tape, and then you remove the duct tape by cutting up one side and wriggling out of it, and then you stuff it with things, and then you have a body double. I'm actually going to be doing, I hope, if I can get enough volunteers, um, I'm going to be doing some life casting of the rest of my limbs, so I can have a double on which to put the armor as I build it, because it's going to be really hard for me to avoid, stretching and contracting muscles so they are not in the right spots when I'm building it on myself. Also, thermoforming with hot plastic on your body is kind of not ideal. Um, so what's the other half? The chat is now across the room. I've got my two cameras set up so I can run between the sewing machine over there, which is where my usual camera is, and then I'm actually using my laptop webcam, which is not a very great camera, as I'm sure you can tell from the quality, but it means that my computer is in a position where it's a little harder for me to keep up with the chat. Flip your webcam and we'll assume the pocket moved. Actually, if I turn the shirt inside out, then it looks like the pocket's on the right side because this fabric's thin enough you can see all the way through it. So anyway, if you are doing any tailoring, either do it on your own body or do it on a cast of your body in such a way that you can actually size it correctly, because just using a tape measure doesn't actually help you with the curves or anything. So I'm trying to button this shirt inside out, which is not a skill I'm called on to do very often. This just barely fastens across the chest, but I want it to hang straight. Oh, good heavens. These buttons. So technically the side seams on this are curved. They're not very curved. So we're going to be curving them a lot more. I think, actually, they're fairly straight. So I have somewhere my pins. Straight pins, useful things. I'm going to just keep my side seam as straight as possible. Pinch in to where it is close to the body but not right up against it. There's something called wearing ease, which is the amount of fabric you have loose around your body for the clothes to move with you. And you do want to leave some wearing ease in when you're tailoring a garment. You don't want it skin tight unless it's supposed to be skin tight like a bodysuit, which a non-stretch shirt should probably not be that tight because you won't be able to breathe. And I'm just going to make a line of pins overlapping so it's a continuous line and go down the side and curve it out a bit above the hip. And then what I'm going to do is pull this off after I've pinned both sides, take it over to the sewing machine, and run a line of stitching along where these pins are. There are a couple of different ways to do this. You can do it with pins. You can actually just mark it with a fabric marker or chalk, tailor's chalk, so you have a line to follow. I do it with pins most often because I'm lazy and I don't like pinning and then drawing, and also because the pins hold the fabric in place so the front and back stay exactly where you put them. And because this shirt is going to be worn open in front, it actually, in the character art, it kind of hangs this far open, and there's no way, it's a jacket, not a shirt technically, and there's no way for it to close because there's not enough fabric for it to actually go around the character's body. So I can make this fairly tight and not worry about it being too tight on my body because that's the way it is in the show. Which way did I do those? I did those down. Good, I did it right. Because I'm right-handed, and because I tend to start with the pins pointing down because they're easier to put in that way, I have to be careful to make sure that the fabric will be facing with the pins in the direction that it'll be easy to pull them out toward myself when I'm sewing, as opposed to stabbing them into my hand when I'm sewing. I'm lurking over here in the shadow of this. I turned out the overhead light in this room because it was washing out the camera, because again, this camera is not the greatest on my laptop. And the direct overhead light made this sort of cone of impenetrable shine in the middle of the room. So the lighting setup is not ideal today. Do you want to show your direction of pins? Yeah, I can do that in just a second. I will move my body over so you can see. As soon as I'm finished pinning this. Now, the tricky thing is making sure I don't pin this to the shirt that's actually on the mannequin. Ow. Or stab myself and bleed all over my white shirt. Okay, so this, yeah, that is the right way. So I've got all the pins with the head of the pin toward the top and the, is this showing? This is not showing very well. Let me see if I can get this close. That is as close as it's going to get. The head of the pin is at the top, and then the pointy part, the sharp part of the pin, is going down. So I did this by putting it in, twisting it, and pushing it all the way through. This means when I sew, the heads of the pin are going to be facing toward me so I can pull them out as I stitch, which you're going to see in just a second, because I'm going to go do that right now. And then you can watch it live, real time. Oh good, I did not pin it to any of my shirts underneath. This is Flynn's undershirt, which I'm supposed to be sewing stuff on, which is why it's on the mannequin, but it's super thin, so it doesn't actually add much bulk. It's fine. Okay. So I'll do this fairly slowly to make sure I don't end up with any wrinkles or puckers. Let me get my thread tails out of here. And I had the foresight to switch the thread to white thread when I turned on the machine earlier to make sure everything was working, because it was not loaded with white thread. Alright, so as I sew, I want to be able to pull the pins out and drop them on my magnetic pin cushion without stabbing myself. If the pins are pointed with the pointy part facing me, then I have to try to do it this way as I sew, and it's very difficult, and I usually end up running the pin into my hand and stabbing myself and bleeding everywhere because the direction of the fabric is dragging those points forward. So the pins are going to give me the guide to follow on the line of the curve. I'm just going to pull them out one by one as I go. I do not want to stitch over any pins and break my needle. It is very damaging to your machine as well, because it can throw off your timing on the machine if you suddenly hit a piece of metal while you're sewing. This is trying to pucker. Don't you dare. And I'm just having that seam die right up into the sleeve seam there. Snip off the thread tails. So now I don't actually know where the camera's pointing, but now I have a line of stitching pulling, if this shows, kind of shows. It's a curved line right here, pulling that side seam in. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. It is impossible for me to see what the camera is seeing while I'm actually working, so I will just trust that something is showing up on the camera, and if not, then I suppose you can listen to the sound of my voice narrating what I'm doing. I tried to set it up so that it would show the machine. I need a production team, but that's not going to happen in a pandemic. Wow, I pinned this so efficiently I can't get the pins out. There's seam number 2. Oh, and I stitched right through the care tag. Oh well, it's easily removed later. Okay, so if I've done this correctly, let me turn this right side out again. It should hang much more nicely on the body and be less boxy. Oh, and it really needs ironed, which I can also do. There we go. So it is now hanging, actually just about right for the amount that it's supposed to be hanging open. I'll straighten that out. Once it's ironed, it'll look a little better. I don't want it as far open as it is on character art because it would look really bad in 3 dimensions to be like that. But there we go. So what I will do when I don't have all of you on mic with me, because my serger is really loud, is I will go ahead and serge those seams so that all of the excess fabric is taken off and I don't have any of this bulky seam allowance on the side, and that'll make it look much more sleek and professionally done. Because the side seams are originally serged on this shirt, so if I serge them, it'll look just like it was made that way, except, you know, with a better fit. Okay, I also have to do some collar alterations and some sleeve alterations, which means I need a seam ripper. All right, which one of these seam rippers has actually got a point on it? This one should work. I own like 5 seam rippers and all but one of them are broken. Because I'm really hard on these things. Bleeding on shirt, authentic distressing. Yeah, not for this costume though. I mean, this is from like a happy little kids show. I don't think we want a lot of authentic blood. I say as I immediately put myself at risk by holding the fabric too close to the seam ripper. Seam rippers are not actually meant to be used the way most people use them. And they're not meant to be used the way I'm using it now. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good options for separating this collar, so that's what I'm going to be doing. The proper way to use a seam rippers, if I can, let me see if I can get it to show. So a seam ripper has 2 sides. There's the long pointy side with the stabby bit that always cuts into your hand and causes you to bleed all over your costume. And then there's the little red plastic ball that you can see here. The red plastic ball side is what's actually supposed to go into the seam and cut into your seam, not the long pointy stabby bit that cuts your hand open. So you're not really supposed to fish the seams out. You're supposed to just be able to slide this through and separate the seam as you go. But that doesn't really work for a finished garment like this where it's got a double row of stitching. And if you get a really high-end seam ripper, like they have nice solid brass and titanium seam rippers. I've never owned one of those. All of mine are like, these are the kind that come in the free sewing kits. They're terrible. I think one of the seam rippers I have over there is a 1960s insurance promotion item. Like, I have a lot of random seam rippers. But anyway, you can get really, really nice ones that are very expensive. And they come with like instruction manuals, which always seems like a little bit of overkill to me. But if I were the sort of person who would buy a very expensive brass seam ripper, which I'm not, I suspect I would appreciate that more. I don't know how to use any of these things properly. I learn and then I'm like, oh wow, I feel dumb because I've been doing it wrong for 15 years. So this shirt, which is actually a fairly nicely made shirt, and I feel a little bad cutting it up, has little plastic inserts inside the collars, which are designed to keep the collar nice and crisp so it doesn't wrinkle, and keep the points pointy so they can't fold in on themselves and you don't have to iron them. I need to dismantle the entire collar and take those plastic inserts out because I need to cut the collar to a new shape, and the plastic inserts are not the right shape. So I cannot get this corner seam undone either. Yeah, Laura, I didn't use it as intended for years until like I saw somebody doing, you know, some professional who actually like had training doing a video on the internet, and she was griping about how nobody used seam rippers correctly. And I watched and I'm like, oh yeah, I don't use seam rippers correctly. So now I know how to do it. I still do it wrong most of the time, but that's because frequently the types of things I'm ripping are not designed. It's not the sort of seam that you're actually supposed to be able to rip with a seam ripper. Okay, I got half the plastic insert out. I gotta get the... Oh gosh, I can't get this open. They are stitched in securely. And there is a double row of stitching around this collar, which makes it a very nice, clean, finished collar. But you're not supposed to be able to do what I'm doing to it. I'm going to do my level best not to stab myself on live streaming video and bleed everywhere. We always have a saying that, if you draw blood while making the costume, it's going to be a good costume. That's generally because we draw blood while making every costume, and the odds are good that, it's going to happen sooner or later. Okay, there we go. Finally. All right, here's the plastic bit. This is, there's a name for these. I don't remember what it is, but they're little plastic things that go inside of shirt collars. Nice shirts have them. This used to. Now it has only one. It'll have 0 in a few minutes. So the way that was sewn in here, there are 3 layers to this collar. There were 4 with the plastic bit. So there's the inside fabric. It's a self-lined, so the collar is the same on the front and back. But the outer fabric here is just a thin layer of, I think this is actually a cotton poly blend. Then there is some interfacing, which is a stiffener, and then there is the layer that is on the other side of that. So it's 2 layers of fabric with interfacing in the middle. And the whatever these are called that I can't remember the name of, was sewn to the underneath layer. So the stitching wouldn't show from the outside, but it was sewn to the interfacing, and then the entire thing holds the collar point in place. Let's see. I'm glad that other people accidentally stab themselves with their craft tools on the regular. Yeah. Leather edge beveler to the inside of the left ring finger. Ooh, ouch. So I stabbed myself really badly a few times a couple weeks ago. So I decided, like a brilliant person, I'm like, hey, I've never done needle felting before. I need to make a little mascot character for this costume. I think I'll teach myself needle felting tonight. So I did. I ordered some material and started needle felting. And I can show you what I made. I made myself a plug. This is the only thing I've ever needle felted was this little mascot character. And I did it in less than 24 hours, like from start to finish. And it was, really easy because needle felting, you just stab stuff basically. But I bought a starter kit that comes with several different kinds of needles, and it comes with little finger cots, little protectors for your fingers so you don't injure yourself. Except the leather's not very thick, and needle felting needles are very nasty, and they just go right through the leather. So I actually impaled all the way through my finger on a couple of occasions, like through the finger, coming in and out both sides. So I learned that I'm going to need to get some really heavy duty, like, I don't know, steel gauntlets, welding gloves, something if I do more needle felting in the future, because that put a lot of holes in my finger and I bled a lot. I had to be very careful because I was sitting on my white couch at the time and suddenly there was blood all over me. I should probably give blood warnings before I talk about this too. I won't be showing anything, it's fine. Yeah, needle felting, it is fun. Collar stays. Oh, thank you, Laura. I'm sorry, I'm reading backwards up the chat. It was fun doing the needle felting, and I mean, again, it's really easy to pick up because you can make something your very first time. And it's the sort of thing that I would like. We had a birthday cookout for my dad the day that I decided to do it. So I was just sitting around talking with people outdoors at the cookout and stabbing things. And so it's fun and it's versatile and it's a sort of handwork you can carry around with you. So it's very useful. If you like having handwork to carry around with you. But I just need to come up with better protective gear that doesn't cause me to lose parts of my finger. But, if you think of it as a blood sacrifice to make your costume better, I guess it's less distressing when you injure yourself. Still not the main goal, though. You don't really want to be injuring yourself. Yeah, so Laura has found that these are called collar stays. And here's the other one. It's joining its friend on the table. They're just little thin pieces of plastic. You could probably make them out of anything if you needed to make them, if you were making a shirt. Now I need to get the stitching out of the interfacing so I can flip this. Did you have one of those foam background pieces to stab into? It came, there was like a little square of polystyrene. It was not a nice mat. I actually pretty much destroyed the little polystyrene square with this one little project. So I understand there are many different types of needle felting mats, depending on whether you're doing like flat felting or 3D felting or, which type of needle you're using. And honestly, I've made exactly one piece and I don't know if I'll do it until I need another mascot character. So I haven't invested in any further materials. But yeah, you definitely would need a mat underneath to avoid injuring yourself any more than necessary, especially when you're just starting on your piece because there's not much to hold on to. Google tells me there are collar tabs in the UK. Okay. Yeah, the blood, sweat, and tears into the costume comments, it's always true. But by the same token, you don't really, if you're working with like white silk, you don't want to have to worry about getting the blood stains out of it. Or white anything else, even this. Okay, so I've now ripped apart the collar. Um, and now I'm going to throw this back on the duct tape dummy and see if I can figure out how this collar is actually supposed to sit. Now that the tabs are gone, I can play with it a little more. So I'm probably going to cheat a bit in the end product because the collar is supposed to stand up. And I'll probably sew a piece inside the back to actually make it stand up. If I wanted to get real cute, I could just put the collar stay back in and put it in the back, pointing upward. But let's see if I can fold these the way they're supposed to go. If I could just tuck that in and not even have to trim this, that'd be real convenient. I don't know if it's going to work that way. It's not going to work that way. Oh well. It was close. Actually, I should check my reference images. Okay, that is more or less what they look like. This is not going to be 100% accurate to the source material, but if I wanted it accurate to the source material, I was going to have to make the shirt from scratch, and I was not feeling that for this costume. We're doing a presentation for a local well, it's not really local. We're doing a presentation for a library that is having a miniature con online on found object costuming. So I'm going to wear this as an example of found object costuming when we do that presentation. Which Laura, if you are still in the chat, you can throw information in the chat because I don't remember when or where it is. But it's a free thing the library is doing in case anybody wants to come watch it. In any case, I wanted a costume that I could show for found object costuming that might be more recognizable to library kids, since this is from a kids animated series. And so I didn't want to have to make everything from scratch. So I've done a lot of modified found objects for it. That's sort of kind of close. We're going to call that good. I'm going to crease that in place with the iron before I trim it. And then I get to match it on the other side. We've done a lot of online events this year. So if you want to see any of our full workshops that we do on things like thermoplastics or casting or whatever, we do a fair number of those throughout the year. Normally we do them in person at conventions, but this year they're all virtual. And a lot of them are free. So if you keep an eye on our social media, which again is at the bottom of the screen, then you can find out when those things are happening and come check them out. And you can learn all kinds of things. Because we are all missing conventions this year. Well, and last year. It has been a year and some since we've had any in-person conventions. And since, that's where a lot of our social lives happen, it's been sad. Okay, now let's see if those are actually the same angle. They are fairly close. They are good enough. They are close enough that if anybody is coming up and measuring with a seam gauge on my collar line, I'm probably just going to bite them for being too close to my face. So we're going to call that good. Free event online. Registration is required. Reg opens April 1st and May 3rd. Okay. So thank you for putting that in the chat, Laura. Anybody who wants to see a talk on found item costuming, we will be doing a free talk on found item costuming. And legitimately, like we are a competition group. I say we, and sewing is half the battle. You know, as the logo above me says. And sewing is half the battle is our team name, and we are a competitive group. However, I do a lot of costumes that are not for competition. We all do. And a lot of our non-competition costumes are found item costumes. So, you know, normally I just go to a thrift store, I buy pieces. In this case, I've had to buy a lot of things online because I can't go to the thrift stores during a pandemic. But, you know, it's finding things and doing simple modifications to them as opposed to having to make things from scratch. So for a lot of people who are just starting out in cosplay, or who don't have a lot of costuming experience, or in some cases, if you don't have the time or budget or resources to make a big thing from scratch, it is totally valid to just find clothes that are close to what you want, modify them, and make what you want out of items that already exist. If anybody tells you that you have to make everything from scratch for it to be real cosplay, they're elitist and you can ignore them. Probably at least half of my costumes are found items costumes, or at least incorporate found items into them. Which realistically lets me make a lot more costumes on an annual basis than if I had to make everything from scratch, because I do not have time to make everything from scratch. Especially now that I get to do the Worbla build, which I'm very excited about, but it means that I now have a deadline for that costume as opposed to just, I'll get that done this year. So it's going to be prioritized over some other pieces that I also had on my list. I actually have 5 costumes that I've been working on this year simultaneously, which is something I don't normally do. I've lost my pins. They're there. Something I don't normally do. I normally just do like one competition set and maybe one other set that I work on at the same time. But this year, I was like, hey, I didn't make anything in 2020. I should catch up. So, I'm catching up. Except now I'm not. Now I'm just making Flynn. But that's fine. I will go back to the others once Flynn is mostly finished. So what I've done on this collar, because I know it's not going to show from where I am, I trimmed off the excess part of the collar points, and then I folded the edges to the inside with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to go stitch as soon as I trim this corner because it's not behaving. I'm going to go stitch the edges in place, doing top stitching, so that it matches the rest of the collar, which has a top stitch running around the edge of it. A top stitch is just a stitch line that runs along the edge over a finished seam to give it some edge stability and also for aesthetics, so you have a clean line there. If I can get the pin into that interfacing, because it does not want to behave. All right, that side is done. And next one. There was something in me that resisted buying this shirt, because I'm like, normally I would just go spend $2 at a thrift store and recycle some old shirt that nobody was ever going to use again. But I can't go to thrift stores, which is so sad because I buy everything at thrift stores. Like my own clothes almost entirely come from thrift stores. I very rarely buy things that are new, unless it's something like, you know, a geeky t-shirt or something. Almost everything I buy is secondhand, and this past year, I haven't had a lot of new clothes because of that. New to me clothes. keep sending me sale notifications. I'm like, who is shopping in your stores that you're having sales? It'll be different once we can all have vaccines, but our vaccine rollout is a little bit slow. Okay, this one's going to be a little tricky because the edge keeps wanting to roll, but I will do my best to keep it flat and straight until it is stitched. Go ahead and press the edge again. Make sure I got this folded at the right angle. Yes, I did. Alright, so I've got these pinned. If that, let me hold that in a way you can see it. Pinned along the edge, and I'm going to go top stitch them. Oh, don't be like this. Don't do it. Don't you bind up. There we go. I managed to shatter a needle rather spectacularly earlier today, and it threw my machine tension off just slightly. I need to dismantle everything and clean it, but I didn't want to do it before tonight. It was kind of horribly amusing because I had been sewing with a needle that was getting dull, and it had some weird interfacing adhesive stuck to it. I'm like, okay, I definitely need to change needles. So I changed needles, and I pulled out a brand new package of needles, opened it up, put a brand new needle in the machine, started sewing, and it exploded. It just hit something wrong, and somehow I was sewing vinyl, which is, it's hard to do anyway for some needles. And I think the needle may have just been not quite the right weight. It was an older package too, so who knows. But that needle went into a bunch of different pieces all over the place. So that was fun to try to find all the bits of before I stepped on them. Because when sewing machine needles break, they don't always just break in half. They sometimes shatter, depending on how much pressure is on them and what they hit. Oh, don't do this. Don't be stupid. You're going to be stupid. All right, let's try this the other way. There we go. Just did not want to make that corner cleanly. So now I should have nice matching collar points sticking straight up. This would be easier if my shoulders weren't lopsided, but my shoulders actually are lopsided, so I have to make the clothes crooked to fit them. Okay, there we go. And I'll reinforce that later to make it not slouch back. Okay. And the last thing, well actually there's two things. I need to hem this, although I probably ought to get the shirt that it's going over before I do that. I do have to put the sleeve cuffs on too, which I was cutting out when this thing started. Where did I put my... There. So I just patterned these. I did all this prep during Laura's procrastination talk, which was appropriate since I had left it all until right before my stream to do the prep. Although that was mostly a factor of I had a whole bunch of stuff to get done today and I just didn't get to this one until just now. But I patterned, while I was cramming pizza in my face desperately, I patterned my sleeve cuffs using a newspaper ad. If you need large sheets of paper to pattern things that are larger than a standard legal size, newsprint is really good for that. If you don't have a pad of newsprint, you can just get the ads that come in your mail that you're going to recycle anyway, because they come in big broadsheets. They're actually bigger than newspapers in many cases. And the other thing, French curves are your friend if you're doing any sort of patterning or alteration on collars or sleeves or anything that has a curved edge. Get one that's not as warped as this one. I strongly suspect this curve goes back to the 1960s. I think it was my grandfather's, because all of my drafting tools either came from my grandfather and I inherited them after he died, or they were mine from college. And this is definitely not mine from college. And the plastic, as you can see, is yellow. And it also has like some petrified rubber bands that have melted to one end of it, and it's kind of warped. So I'm pretty sure this is from the 60s. But anyway, if you have a curved stencil like this, that'll help you get the precise curves you need to match up edges. So those are very, very useful tools. And I have some interfacing, which is going to stiffen the cuffs. And I have whatever this material is, I can't actually identify. It was in my interfacing drawer. I don't remember buying it. It actually feels more like buckram than anything, but I don't think I own any buckram, so I don't know what it is. But I'm using it for the sleeve cuffs because I didn't have anything else that matched the white. I have an entire bolt of muslin, and the muslin is a slightly different white, so it didn't quite match. So I'm using this stuff instead. I'm just doing 2 layers of it. But it'll work. It's white-ish, mostly. It's about the same white as the shirt. It's also stiff on its own, so I don't have to reinforce it quite as heavily. I just wish I knew what it was and where it came from. The good news is once it's sewn in place, it should never have to move around or wrinkle or anything because it gets buttoned to the upper part of the sleeve, so it just sits there. So rather than tracing my pattern out on the fabric, I actually just traced the pattern out on the interfacing, cut the interfacing out, and I'm ironing the interfacing onto the fabric, and then I'm just going to cut around it. Because we're doing it that way. It may not be technically correct, but it's what I chose to do. I'm just going to invent my own ways of doing this right now. Also, this material is stiff enough, it's not going to be a problem if I do it that way. If you were using a really delicate material, you wouldn't want to do that, but this stuff is not going anywhere. This is very crisp and very stiff. So it's just going to sit here. I am pinning the 2 layers together, though, so they can't move while I'm cutting. That is important. And I already cut the other one out, so once I have this one cut out, I will stitch them. Stitch them and then flip them and trim the corners. And then I will get to sew them on the shirt. And then I will dig through my bin of buttons that I also inherited from my grandfather that has buttons going back to literal World War II, and find some shirt buttons that match these. I have so many buttons. If anybody ever needs buttons, call me. Okay, so I have this cut out. So I now have two of these. I have this one and I have this one. They are pinned, and I'm going to sew them 3/4 of the way around and then flip them. What was the name of the type of fabric? Oh, buckram. Buckram. It's the type of stiff material that, say, a hat would be made out of, like a traditional lady's hat, not like a Stetson or something, but buckram is what it's called. And it's a stiff sort of modern buckram often feels kind of plasticky, but it's like it feels almost like a heavily starched linen type texture. And usually it'd be used for making structural things like, you'd see it in collars that stand up or in, as I mentioned, hats. It's a very stiff, like a dense mesh type material. And you don't see it as often as you used to because we now have other things that we use for reinforcing materials, and everything is kind of mechanically mass produced, so people aren't hand making as much. But for people who do reenactments or people who do period fashion and want authentic looking materials, you can still get it, and people do still hand make things like that. In fact, I was talking to a friend today who's hand making hats out of buckram. So we also have things like Foss-Shape that we can use now, which is a thermoplastic that comes in a fabric form that you just heat up and shape it into what you want. So we have new technologies that do the same thing differently. I'm going to put this seam ripper away before I lose it in the pile of stuff on my table. So since I'm going to be sewing these on the underside of the shirt sleeves and the inside of the cuffs, I'm going to start stitching from the middle of the bottom and leave a gap so I can flip it right side out, but that way the outside will all be completely seamed properly. That is not where I want that. Let's put that seam in the right spot. Still using my top stitch seam allowance. That's not going to work on these. I don't know if this will show in the video, but in order to make these corners very crisp, I'm stopping with the needle in the fabric on the corner. So I put the needle down and the presser foot comes up. If you're doing it on a manual machine, you can just lower the needle and then raise your presser foot manually. This one does it automatically. And then I just rotate my fabric 90 degrees and continue sewing. So that gives you an extremely crisp corner that comes to a perfect point, as opposed to having a weird wonky, I tried to curve the seam type corner. And I will sew the other one, and then I will come back to the camera and show how to clip corners, because I had somebody ask me about this just this past week. So I might as well do a demo. so let's talk about corner clipping. So the way this works, oh, there we go. I have sewn around almost all the way around the edge, and then I have this hole here, and I want to flip this entire thing right side out. The problem being these corners, which have, if it shows, they have a sharp corner here all the way around where the seam is about 1/2 inch inside the edge of the fabric, which means if I flip this, actually, I may just be able to show you if I can get this to flip. If I flip this without trimming anything, I'm going to end up with a really ugly bunch of fabric stuck in the corner. So this is turned right side out, but all of that fabric that was sticking up in the outside of that point is now wadded up inside this corner. There's no way for that seam to come out crisply, and it's never going to iron flat because there's a huge lump there. So what we do instead is we clip the corners. And the tricky part of this is just making sure you don't cut into your seam. I'm going to go ahead and iron this flat again so that you can see better, because I just wadded it up really badly. Okay. So anytime you are sewing a corner, you have this point coming up, and then that same edge is mirrored in your seam. To clip your corner before flipping it right side out, you want to take your scissors and cut straight across that diagonal as close to the seam as you can get it without cutting into it. So there is about, I don't know, maybe 1 millimeter of space between where that seam is and where the edge of the fabric is. If you have a fabric that's very stiff or wants to bunch up, you can also then go back and trim these corners to make it a little less bulky. That really matters mostly for certain shapes of corners, but you end up with a lot less fabric around here. You do not want to cut into your seam because obviously if you cut that thread, then you will end up with your seam coming undone, which is not the goal. But just clipping straight across will reduce the bulk in those corners. So then when I flip it right side out the next time, instead of having a big ugly lump of fabric in the corners, this poor material does not like being wadded up. Okay, so now I've flipped a corner out, and obviously this will get pressed down, but just by flipping it, I now have a much flatter corner that will press much more nicely. And if I use a pin to reach down and grab that little bit of fabric that is stuck, I can get this very, very pointy. So I can end up with a perfect 90-degree corner. There. Perfect 90-degree corner, very crisp. Once I iron that, it'll be really pointy. And that is only possible if you clip your corners. So I figured I would mention that since I had somebody write to me this week and ask. If you do any home decorating type stuff, like you make pillowcases or you're making your own curtains, you want those really crisp corners. And obviously on certain parts of garments, like collar points, you want those too. And there are lots and lots of tutorials online for sewing corners, reinforcing sewing corners, making everything crisp and clean and pretty, because it shows up so often in things like home decorating and people do their own craft projects. But also, you know, if you want to make yourself a tote bag or anything else that comes with corners, they're very simple projects and very easy to do, but you want them to look really nice. Okay, so once I get all these corners flipped completely out, because this fabric is super stiff. There we go. All right, now I'm going to iron this because it's kind of wadded up. The good news is it presses out really nicely. Bad news is I still have no idea what this material is. But it irons really well. All right, so now I have all of my seams are crisp and pretty and flat except for this part that's not stitched, which is a big ugly wad. So what I'm going to do is take the parts that are stitched at the edge, pull it so there's tension, and it naturally wants to fold a little bit to follow the seam allowance it's already folded in. And I'm going to pinch right along that line and press that line down so I can stitch it. And this fabric is really nice because it just wants to continue the crease from the seam allowance. If you've got like a knit, it's a little trickier to do this, and you just have to measure it and fold it in as you go. Oh, I'm bleeding. Cool. I think I caught a hangnail on my sewing machine and tore it. It wasn't even the seam ripper that got me this time. Okay, so now that I've pressed that, you can see here's the part that's stitched over here, and this part is unstitched, but now that I've pressed it down, it'll be very easy to stitch right along that line. And I'm just going to run a little line of stitching right along the edge to hold it together. This is the part that's going to be sewn inside the sleeve, so it doesn't matter what it looks like, but I still want it to be as clean as possible. So here's the finished one. So the surface seam is running between these 2 points, but it doesn't really show because it's white thread on a white fabric, so it's fine. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the other one. And on things like collars and cuffs, if you're using a heavier fabric, you may need to trim more of your seam allowance just to eliminate bulk. It depends a lot on the fabric you're using. This one is pretty crisp, so I don't have to worry about it, but some materials it really does make a difference if you cut your seam allowance down to reduce how much of it there is at the edges. And on some materials, especially if I'm layering materials, I'll just serge all of it so I don't have to deal with the seam allowance. Obviously that's only helpful if you have a serger, but you can also, if you have a machine that does an overlock stitch, you can overlock and then trim it, and it helps. Trim, the bulky parts like corners and things. But serging gets rid of a lot of the extra material and makes your edges pretty strong and reinforced. The disadvantage is you can't fix anything if it goes wrong when serging, so make sure it's the way you want it before you serge it, because cutting off the edge is permanent. Here's the other thing seam rippers are good for. They have that little pointy bit, which is really, really useful for reaching down in corners and fishing out the part of the fabric that doesn't want to come to the surface. I use them for that a lot. You can use a pin, but if you need something a little heavier duty, the seam ripper actually works better. So if you need to get your corners really crisp and they don't want to come out, stab them. Solution to many problems in life. If it isn't cooperating, stab it. Please don't quote me on this in your legal defense. Okay, now I'll stitch this one, and then both of them will be done. Okay, now figuring out the best attachment. I'm going to flip this again because I want to sew this to the inside of the sleeve. Alright, so I'm going to fold this in half, find the seam on the bottom, and line up the halfway point with this seam because the points actually go to the outside. Pins are useful. There we go. So if I do that, that will fold around that way. Is that the way I want it? Yes. Always have to do some mental gymnastics to remember which side things go on and how they fold in the end product. I'm going to do one of these, make sure it looks okay, and then I'll do the other one, rather than sewing them both on and then discovering, no, I actually should have pinned it a different way. So let's start with this one. And I need to take off that part of the sewing arm to fit this. Actually, is this going to fit at all? Oh, this will be fun. Oh, it's really snug. Come on. Come on, you can do it. Get in there. Squeeze. This barely wants to fit over my arm, my sewing machine arm. But it does, so that's the important part. I'm going to baste this first, just in case. Okay, let's see what this looks like right side out. Well, it needs pressed, but I think that should be good. And then buttons should go right up here. One there and one there-ish. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, good. Actually, rather than... Should I just serge that? Yes, I should. I should just serge that. Because that'll make it super secure. So let me tuck that back inside for now. And then I do the same thing on the other side. This poor duct tape dummy is slightly out of kilter because, gosh, I made this thing 12, 14 years ago. Duct tape doesn't have that long a lifespan. I've restuffed it a couple times, but could probably use it again. There's that. Where did I get all these tiny straight pins? These are short. I don't buy short straight pins. Who put these on my pin cushion? There's a bunch of them. Now I get to stitch this one. Oh, hey, my thread just broke. Let's fix that. Okay, so here's our finished one. Obviously these need pressed and serged, which I will do when I'm not on mic because noise. But there's our end result. Get our collar popped up. And then apart from pressing and serging those and serging the side seams, the only thing I need to do is hem the bottom so that it's a straight edge, like so, and then it'll be done. So that was a pretty quick turnaround, considering I just took the tags off this today. So it's a fairly quick process to modify things. And seeing that it is now 9:13, that seems like a good quitting spot since the next couple things I have to do are serging, and that is noisy. So thank you all for coming and hanging out. I have no idea what I'm doing next week. It depends on whether or not my new materials arrive. Probably some part of Flynn. Odds are good because that's now my priority for everything. So thank you for coming. I will see whoever joins me next Tuesday. If you have any questions or any topic recommendations or suggestions or anything like that, feel free to throw them at me either here or on social media. This is also a form of social media, but on the other social medias. And I will hopefully see you next week. Enjoy the remainder of your Tuesday evening or whatever part of the day it is in your part of the world. And I will see you later. Thanks for hanging out. Bye-bye.